Hey guys, tonight we begin with different civilizations in human history, ancient Rome, and at least legions and shadows, in silence, and in a kind of isolation that goes far beyond just being alone. You find yourself standing at the edge of a medieval town, where the air smells faintly of smoke and damp wood, and the distant chatter of people fades the moment you come into view. And just so you know, you probably wouldn't survive this job for more than a day. Not because it's physically impossible, but because everything about it slowly wears you down. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there for a moment longer than necessary, just outside the town's main path, already sensing that something about your presence shifts the atmosphere. Conversations quiet. People don't look at you directly, but they notice you. They always do. This wasn't a job you chose. That's the first thing you come to understand. In many medieval regions, roles like yours were often passed down through families, or assigned to those who had no other place in society. Executioners, interrogators, and those involved in punishment were frequently grouped together into a kind of unofficial class necessary but unwanted. And now, somehow, that's where you belong. You begin walking, your steps slow, deliberate. The ground beneath you is uneven, packed dirt mixed with scattered straw. A cart rolls past in the distance, the driver glancing at you briefly before quickly looking away. It's not hostility exactly, it's avoidance. There's a house waiting for you at the far edge of the town. Not quite outside it, but not truly within it either. That's where people like you live. Close enough to be called upon, far enough to be kept separate. When you reach it, the door creaks open before you even knock. He's already there, your mentor. He doesn't greet you with warmth or curiosity. He simply steps aside, allowing you to enter. The inside is dim, lit only by a narrow window and a small flame flickering in the corner. You're late, he says, though you're not. You nod anyway. It's easier that way. There's something about him that feels still, not cold, not cruel, just controlled in the way that makes you aware of every movement you make. You'll learn quickly, he continues, or you won't last. That's all the encouragement you get. And strangely, it's enough, because even now, you can feel it. This life isn't built on comfort or reassurance. It's built on necessity. You set your things down, though there isn't much to unpack. A small bundle of clothing, a few personal items that already feel out of place here. This isn't a trade like others, he says, watching you carefully. You don't apprentice in the open. You don't speak of it outside these walls. You glance at him. Why? You ask. He studies you for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Because people want what we do, he replies slowly, but they don't want to know how it's done. That answer lingers in the air longer than anything else he's said, and it settles somewhere deep in your mind, because it explains everything you've already begun to notice. The way people avoid your gaze, the way the town feels slightly quieter when you're near, the way your presence exists just outside their comfort. You are necessary, but never welcome. As the day fades into evening, your mentor begins to show you the space, not in detail, not yet, just enough for you to understand its purpose. A table, a few tools carefully arranged, though he doesn't explain them. Not yet. That will come later. For now, it's about understanding the role. You are not here to act on your own, he says. You follow orders. Always. You nod. It sounds simple, but there's something in his tone that suggests it isn't. In medieval justice systems, interrogators were often acting under authority local lords, courts, or officials who determined when and how questioning should take place. It wasn't random. It was structured, controlled, part of a larger system that aimed to extract truth, or at least something that could be accepted as truth. Historians still argue whether these systems were more about justice or control, but standing here now, you can already feel that distinction beginning to blur. Your mentor steps closer, his voice quieter now. You don't decide guilt, he says. You don't decide innocence. There's a pause. You exist between the two. That thought settles heavily. Between. not part of judgment, not part of outcome, just the space in the middle. You spend the rest of the evening in silence, observing more than doing. The room grows darker, the small flame casting long, shifting shadows across the walls, and in those shadows your mind begins to adjust, to accept, to understand. Not fully, not yet, but enough to know that this life is not temporary in the way you might have hoped, is not something you pass through, is something you become part of. As night falls completely, you step outside for a moment, the cool air brushing against your face. The town is quieter now, most people already inside, doors closed, lights dim. You look back at the house, at the faint glow from within, and you realize something that hadn't fully formed until now. This isn't just where you work, it's where you belong, not because you chose it, but because the world around you has already decided. And as you step back inside, closing the door softly behind you, that realization settles into place. Quiet, unavoidable, and strangely final. Morning doesn't arrive gently. There's no slow easing into the day, no warmth or comfort waiting for you when you open your eyes. Instead, you wake to stillness, the kind that feels deliberate, almost watchful. The air is cool, the light thin as it slips through the narrow window, and for a moment you forget where you are. Then it returns, not as a shock, but as a quiet reminder. You sit up, the wooden frame beneath you creaking slightly, and across the room, your mentor is already awake. Of course he is, sitting exactly where you last saw him, as if he never moved. You'll start today, he says, without turning. There's no build-up, no explanation, just the beginning. You stand, brushing the stiffness from your arms, and move toward him. The room feels smaller in the morning light, more defined, less shadowed. And now, you notice details you didn't before, the careful arrangement of objects, the precision of everything in its place. Nothing here is random. Watch, he says, that's your first lesson. Not doing, watching. He moves slowly, deliberately, demonstrating something you don't yet fully understand. His hands are steady, his posture controlled, his attention fixed on the smallest details. There's no wasted movement, no hesitation. You follow every motion with your eyes, trying to understand not just what he's doing, but how, because that's what matters here. Not speed, not strength, control. In medieval training for roles like this, much of the learning was observational. There were no written manuals, no formal instruction, as you might expect in other trades. Knowledge was passed down directly, quietly, often within closed spaces like this one. Historians still argue how structured this training truly was, whether it followed consistent methods or varied widely depending on the region. But what you're experiencing now feels precise, intentional, almost ritualistic. Your mentor finishes the demonstration and steps back. Again, he says, you hesitate, not because you don't understand the command, but because now it's your turn. You step forward, your movements slower, less certain. You try to mirror what you saw, recalling each detail, each motion. Your hands don't feel as steady. Your posture doesn't feel as natural. You're thinking too much. You can feel it. Stop, he says. You freeze. What are you doing? He asks. You open your mouth, then close it again. I'm trying, you reply. He shakes his head slightly. No, you're thinking. There's that word again, thinking. He steps closer, adjusting your stance with small, precise movements. You don't need to understand everything yet, he says. You need to repeat it. There's a difference. And you're beginning to see it. This isn't about questioning or analyzing, it's about building something deeper. Instinct. The rest of the morning passes in repetition, again, and again, and again. Each time, your movements become slightly more controlled, slightly more aligned with what you observed. Not perfect, not even close, but closer. Your mentor doesn't praise you. He doesn't criticize you harshly either. He simply watches, corrects, repeats. At one point, you notice something strange. A rhythm, not in the sounds but in the movements themselves. A kind of flow that your body begins to recognize, even if your mind hasn't fully caught up yet. It's subtle, but it's there, and once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. There's a brief pause around midday, though no one announces it. Your mentor steps away, leaving you alone in the room for the first time since you arrived. The silence feels different now, less heavy, more focused. You sit for a moment, your hands resting on your knees, your breathing slowing. Your mind drifts, but not far. It circles back to the same thoughts, the same realizations. This is only the beginning, and already it's changing you. There's a small detail you haven't noticed before. A faint marking on the wall near the table. It's warm, almost invisible, as if it's been there for years. You run your fingers over it lightly. Not a symbol, not a word, just a mark. A trace of repetition, a reminder that others stood here before you, learning the same motions, making the same mistakes, following the same quiet path. A quirky detail you might not expect, but in some places, it said the practitioners of roles like this would leave subtle marks or patterns behind, not as signatures, but as unconscious habits formed over time. Historians still argue whether these traces were intentional or simply the result of long-term use. But standing here now, it feels like a connection. A silent one. To those who came before, your mentor returns without a sound, and you step back immediately, your focus snapping into place. Good, he says. It's the first time he said that. Just one word, but it lands heavier than anything else. Because here, approval isn't given freely. It's earned. The afternoon continues much like the morning, but something has shifted. Your movements are more confident now, your hesitation less noticeable. You're still thinking, but less. And that's progress. As the light begins to fade again, your mentor finally stops. That's enough, he says. You lower your hands, the tension in your body releasing slowly. You'll do this again tomorrow, he adds. Of course you will. There's no end point here, no completion, just continuation. That evening, you step outside once more. The air cooler now, the town quieter than before. You feel different, though you can't quite explain how. Not stronger, not more capable, just more aware of your body, of your role, of the space you now occupy. And as you stand there looking out at the distant lights of the town, you realize something small but important. You're no longer just observing this life. You've started to step into it. Slowly, carefully, but undeniably. And as you turn back toward the house, the faint glow welcoming you once again, that realization settles into place. This isn't something you're preparing for. It's something you're already becoming. By the time you begin to truly notice the tools, you've already spent hours in their presence. They've been there all along, resting quietly on the table, hanging neatly along the wall, arranged with a care that suggests both purpose and routine. But until now, they've felt like part of the background, objects without meaning. That changes today. Your mentor doesn't announce it. He simply walks over to the table, rests his hand lightly on its surface and says, "You should know what you're looking at." You step closer. There's no dramatic reveal, no sense of intimidation in his tone. Just a quiet expectation that you're ready to see things more clearly now. The tools themselves are simpler than you expected, not elaborate, not decorated, functional. That's the word that comes to mind. Each one looks like it was made with a specific purpose, but without excess. Wood, iron, rope materials that are common, almost ordinary in a medieval setting. And yet, here they carry a different kind of weight. Your mentor picks one up, not hurriedly, not cautiously, just with familiarity. This, he says, turning it slightly in his hand, is not what matters. You glance at him, confused. It's how it's used, he continues. He sets it back down exactly where it was, aligning it with the others in a way that feels almost instinctive. You could replace any of these, he adds, but you cannot replace skill. That idea stays with you, because it shifts your focus away from the objects and onto the control behind them. In medieval Europe, tools used for interrogation varied widely depending on region and time period. Some were simple devices designed to apply pressure or restraint, while others became more specialized. But across most historical accounts, one thing remains consistent: the emphasis on technique over the tool itself. Historians still argue how standardized these methods were, or how much they depended on individual practitioners. But standing here now, it feels clear that the person matters more than the instrument. Your mentor gestures for you to step closer. Look, he says. You do, not just at the shapes or materials, but at the details, the wear along certain edges, the way some handles are smoother than others, the faint marks left by repeated use. These aren't new, they've been used. Again and again. There's something oddly grounding about that realization. Not comforting, exactly, but clarifying. This isn't theoretical. This is practiced. You reach out instinctively, your fingers brushing lightly against one of the tools. The surface is cool, solid, unremarkable in any ordinary sense, but here in this room it feels different, he notices. Careful, he says, not sharply, but firmly. You pull your hand back slightly. Respect the tools, he continues, not because they are special, but because what you do with them is. There's a quiet emphasis in his words. Respect, not fear. That distinction matters. The morning continues with a different kind of lesson now. Instead of repetition alone, you're guided through understanding. Not in the sense of questioning, but in the sense of familiarity. He shows you how each tool is held, how it's positioned, how small adjustments can change everything. There's a level of precision here that surprises you, not just in action, but in preparation. Everything has its place. Everything has its purpose. At one point, he pauses, looking at you carefully. What do you see? He asks. You glance at the table, then back at him. Tools, you reply. He shakes his head slightly. No. You hesitate. Control, he says. That word again, it keeps returning. Because that's what this role is built on. Not force, not chaos. Control. A quirky detail begins to emerge as you spend more time observing. Some of the tools have subtle differences that don't seem entirely necessary. Slight variations in size, in shape, in weight. You notice it. Why are there so many? You ask. Your mentor considers the question. Because people are not the same, he replies. That answer is simple, but it opens up something deeper. This isn't a one-size process. It's adjusted, measured, adapted. Historians still argue whether practitioners in roles like this developed personal preferences or systems over time, but it seems likely that experience played a major role in shaping how things were done. And here, in this room, you can feel that experience. Not spoken, but present. The afternoon shifts back into practice, but now it carries a different weight. You're not just repeating movements. You're beginning to understand the relationship between those movements and the tools themselves. How one affects the other. How precision matters at every level. There's a moment where your grip is slightly off, your angle not quite aligned. Your mentor corrects you immediately, his adjustment small but exact. Again, he says. And you do. Each time you get a little closer. Not perfect, but closer. As the light begins to fade, you step back, your arms slightly tired, your mind more focused than it was this morning. You look at the table again, at the tools. They don't feel unfamiliar anymore, not entirely. And that realization is both subtle and significant, because it means you're changing, adapting, becoming. That evening, as you sit in the quiet once more, your thoughts drift not to the tools themselves, but to what they represent. Not objects, but responsibility. Not instruments, but extensions of control. And as the shadows stretch across the room, the faint light flickering softly, you realize something that hadn't fully formed until now. This role isn't defined by what you use, it's defined by how you use it. And that understanding settles into place, quietly but firmly, just like everything else in this life. The first time you're told to come along, it doesn't feel like a milestone. There's no sense of ceremony, no acknowledgement that this moment matters more than the others. Your mentor simply stands, adjusts his coat, and glances at you. Walk, he says. That's it. You follow him out into the cool morning air, the town already stirring but not fully awake. A few people move along the streets, carrying baskets, opening stalls, beginning the slow rhythm of another day. And yet, as you walk beside him, something feels different, quieter. Not because the town has changed, but because you have. There's a direction to your steps now, a purpose you can't ignore. You're not just observing today. You can feel it. Something is about to happen. You don't ask questions. You've learned that much already. Instead, you walk in silence, keeping pace with your mentor as he leads you toward a building you haven't entered before. It stands near the center of town, more solid than the others, its doors heavier, its windows narrower. A place of authority. Inside, the air is cooler, stiller. A man stands near a table, his posture upright, his expression unreadable. He acknowledges your mentor with a brief nod, then glances at you. You brought him, he says. Your mentor nods. It's time. Time. The word settles in your chest, heavier than you expected. You remain still, your hands at your sides, your focus narrowing as the room seems to grow quieter around you. You're led further inside, through a narrow passage, until the sounds of the outside world fade completely. The walls feel closer here, the air thicker, as if the space itself is holding its breath. And then you stop. Your mentor steps forward, leaving you just behind him. Watch, he says again. That word feels different now, more serious, more final. What follows isn't chaotic. That's the first thing you notice. It's controlled, measured. The movements are deliberate, the voice is low, the atmosphere focused in a way that feels almost procedural. This isn't anger, it's process. In medieval judicial systems, interrogation, especially under pressure, was often considered a legitimate method of obtaining information or confession, particularly in serious cases. It was regulated in varying degrees depending on the region, sometimes requiring official approval before it could even begin. Historians still argue how strictly these rules were followed, but what you're witnessing now feels structured, not random. There's a sequence, a rhythm. Your mentor moves with the same precision you've seen during training. Every action is controlled, every adjustment intentional, and you watch, not with curiosity anymore, but with awareness, because now you understand what those movements lead to. You don't focus on the person in front of him, not fully. You can't. Instead, your attention stays on your mentor, on his hands, his posture, the way he maintains that same calm, steady control, no matter what. That's the lesson. Not what's happening, but how it's being done. There's a moment where everything pauses, just briefly. A question is asked. The room waits. Then the process continues. It's not dramatic, it's not chaotic, it's quiet, and somehow that makes it more unsettling. A quirky detail crosses your mind, something you once overheard, or perhaps imagined, that in some places, interrogators were expected to maintain a completely neutral demeanor, not reacting emotionally to anything happening around them, almost like a performer holding a role. Historians still argue whether this level of detachment was truly practiced or simply idealized, but watching your mentor now, it feels real. He doesn't waver, not once. Eventually, it ends. Not abruptly, just complete. Your mentor steps back, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady. There's no visible reaction, no sign that anything out of the ordinary has occurred. To him, it hasn't. To you, it has. You follow him out without a word, the hallway feeling longer on the way back, the air outside cooler, sharper against your skin. For a moment, you just stand there, your senses catching up with you. The sounds of the town return, slowly, voices, footsteps, distant movement. Everything continues. As if nothing happened, your mentor begins walking again, and you fall into step beside him. You watched, he says. You nod. There's a pause. What did you see? The question feels heavier than it should. You think for a moment, your mind replaying the details. Control, you reply. He glances at you briefly. Good. Just like that. No further explanation. No discussion, because there doesn't need to be. The lesson wasn't in the event itself. It was in the execution of it. The method. The precision. The absence of hesitation. As you return to the house, the familiar space feels slightly different now. Not because it has changed, but because you have. You've crossed another line. Not by doing, but by seeing. And once you've seen something like that, you don't unsee it. The rest of the day passes in quiet repetition, your movement slower, more deliberate. Your mind is still processing, still adjusting to the reality of what this role truly involves. It's no longer abstract, no longer theoretical. It's real, and you are part of it. That night, as you lie down, the darkness settling around you, your thoughts drift not in chaos, but in quiet reflection. You expected something louder, more intense, but instead, it was calm, controlled, and that's what stays with you, because it means that this life isn't about extremes. It's about precision, about maintaining that steady line between action and emotion, about becoming the kind of person who can stand in that space without losing control. And as sleep slowly begins to take over, your mind settling into a softer rhythm, you realize something that feels both distant and immediate at the same time. You're no longer just learning how this works. You're learning how to be part of it. After that first experience, something settles into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, almost unnoticed way. The uncertainty you carried before hasn't disappeared, but it has shifted. It no longer feels like a barrier. It feels more like something you move alongside. The next time you're called, it doesn't surprise you. Your mentor simply looks up from the table, meeting your gaze for a brief second. "Come," he says. And you do. The walk through town feels different now. Familiar in a way it wasn't before. You've walked these paths enough times that the turns come naturally. The sounds blending into a background rhythm you no longer need to focus on. But the people, they haven't changed. They still step aside slightly, still lower their voices, still avoid looking at you directly. If anything, the distance feels more defined now, not because they know more about you, but because you do. You reach the same building as before, the heavy doors opening with that same slow, deliberate movement. Inside, the air carries that same stillness, that same sense of controlled space where everything happens for a reason. This time, you're not just watching the room, you're noticing its structure, where people stand, how they move, who speaks and when. There's a pattern here, one you didn't fully see before, a system. In medieval legal frameworks, interrogation wasn't always arbitrary. In many regions, especially later in the period, there were guidelines, limits on how often questioning could occur, who had the authority to order it, even what methods were considered acceptable under certain circumstances. Historians still argue how consistently these rules were followed, but the idea of structure is clear, and now you can see it. You stand slightly closer this time, not in the center, but no longer as far back as before. Your position has shifted, even if only by a small amount. Your mentor doesn't tell you to watch. He doesn't need to. You already are. The process begins again, but this time your focus is sharper. You notice the timing between actions, the pauses, the way questions are asked, the way silence is used. That's something new. Silence. It's not empty here. It's intentional. There are moments when nothing happens, where the room seems to hold its breath. And in those moments, you begin to understand something important. The role isn't just about action. It's about presence, about knowing when to move and when not to. A quirky thought crosses your mind, something you once heard in passing, that in certain places, silence during questioning was considered just as powerful as any physical method, that the anticipation, the waiting, could influence outcomes in ways that weren't immediately visible. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate technique or simply an observation made later, but standing here now, it feels real. Silence changes the room. You see it, you feel it. Your mentor continues his work with that same steady control, his movements precise, his demeanor unchanged. There's no variation in his expression, no sign of emotion breaking through, and this time you understand why, because this isn't about reaction, it's about consistency. There's a moment where he pauses just slightly, and your attention sharpens instantly. You expect something to happen, but nothing does. And that's the point. Not every moment leads to action. Some exist only to maintain control. Eventually, the process ends again, just as it did before, not with a sudden stop, but with a quiet completion that leaves the room exactly as it was, structured, controlled, unchanged on the surface. You follow your mentor out once more, the hallway feeling less narrow this time, the air outside less sharp. You're adjusting, without realizing it. You noticed more, he says as you walk. It's not a question. You nod anyway. There's a system, you reply. He glances at you briefly. Yes, that's all he says, but it's enough, because that single word confirms what you've begun to understand. This isn't random. It's not chaos. It's a role within a structure, a function within a larger design. As you return home, your thoughts move differently than before. Less scattered, more focused. You're no longer trying to make sense of everything at once. You're beginning to see the pieces, how they fit, how they connect. The rest of the day passes in practice, but your movements carry a new kind of awareness. Each action feels tied to something larger now, not just repetition for its own sake. You're building something, not just skill, but understanding. That evening, as the light fades and the room settles into its familiar quiet, You sit for a moment longer than usual. You think about the system, about where you fit within it, about how your role connects to decisions made elsewhere, to structures you don't fully see but are beginning to sense. And you realize something that hadn't been clear before. You're not just part of the process, you're part of the mechanism that keeps it functioning. Not the beginning, not the end, but the middle, where everything passes through, and as that thought settles into place, you feel a strange sense of clarity. Not comfort, but alignment. Because now, you're no longer standing outside the system, trying to understand it. You're inside it, moving with it, and that changes everything. As night falls completely, the quiet wrapping around you once again, your thoughts begin to slow. Not because there's nothing left to think about, but because you've found a place to hold it. A structure, a rhythm, something steady enough to carry you forward. And as you lie down, the faint glow of the room fading into darkness, you realize that this life complex, controlled and quietly demanding, is no longer something you're observing from a distance. It's something you're learning to move within, one step at a time. It isn't the work itself that makes the distance clear, it's everything around it, the spaces in between, the moments when nothing is happening, when you're simply walking through the town or standing quietly at the edge of the market, doing nothing more than existing. That's when you feel it most. You step into the street one afternoon, the sun sitting low, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. People are moving as they always do, buying, selling, talking, living their ordinary lives. And then you pass through. Conversations soften, not stop completely, just soften. It's subtle, almost polite, but unmistakable. A woman pulls her basket slightly closer to her side. A man shifts his stance just enough to give you more space than necessary. Even a group of children who had been laughing loudly just moments ago fall quiet as you approach, their eyes following you with a mix of curiosity and something else, something they don't yet understand. You keep walking. You learn not to react. Not because you don't notice, but because reacting would only make the distance sharper. This is simply how it is. In many medieval communities, individuals associated with punishment executioners, interrogators, and similar roles often lived on the margins of society. They were necessary for maintaining order, yet socially excluded due to the nature of their work. Historians still argue whether this exclusion was driven more by fear, moral discomfort, or religious beliefs. But the outcome was consistent. They were kept apart. And now, so are you. You stop at a stall, not because you need anything, but because the act itself feels like a test. A small one, but meaningful. The merchant looks up, his expression neutral at first, then slightly guarded. You place a coin down. He nods, reaches for the item, and sets it on the edge of the table, not directly into your hand. You pick it up without comment. No words are exchanged. The transaction is complete, but the space between you remains. You continue walking, your steps steady, your mind quiet, because this isn't new anymore, it's expected. Back at your home, the silence feels familiar, almost grounding, compared to the subtle tension of the town. Your mentor is there as always, seated in the same place, his presence steady. You went out, he says. You nod. Yes. He studies you for a moment. And? You consider the question. They avoid me, you reply. He nods, as if confirming something obvious. They should, he says. There's no judgment in his voice, no emotion at all, just a statement. Why, you ask. He leans back slightly, his gaze steady. Because it's easier, he replies. That word again. Easier. You've heard it before. It seems to explain more than it should. It's easier to keep distance, he continues, than to understand. You think about that. It makes sense. Understanding requires effort. It requires confronting things people would rather ignore. Distance is simple. A quirky detail comes to mind, something you might not expect. In some regions, executioners and interrogators were not allowed to participate in certain social or religious activities. They were excluded from guilds, from gatherings, sometimes even from communal spaces. And yet, in rare cases, they were also called upon for specific tasks that others wouldn't perform, handling certain types of work that carried a stigma. Historians still argue how widespread these contradictions were, but the pattern is clear. Excluded, and yet needed. That contradiction defines your existence now. You sit down across from your mentor, the room quiet except for the faint sound of movement outside. Does it change, you ask? He looks at you. The distance. There's a pause. No, he says. The answer is simple. Final. You nod slowly, letting that settle, because there's something oddly calming about certainty, even when it's not what you might have hoped for. Later that day you step outside again, but this time you don't go toward the center of town. Instead, you walk along the edge, where the houses thin out and the paths become less defined. It's quieter here, less structured. You pass by a small group of workers repairing a fence. They glance at you briefly, then return to their task without pause. No tension, no hesitation, just indifference. And you realize something important. It's not just about who you are, but where you are. In the center of town, where life is concentrated, where people gather and interact. Your presence disrupts the flow. But here, on the edges, you blend in. Not fully, but enough. You continue walking, the path stretching ahead, the sounds of the town fading behind you. There's a certain calm in this space, a balance. Not acceptance, but less resistance. And that's enough. As the sun begins to set, casting a soft, fading light across the landscape, you turn back toward your home. The same house, the same space. But now, it feels different. Not because anything has changed externally, but because you've begun to understand your place within it. You're not part of the town in the way others are. You don't move through its center with ease. You exist at its boundary, where things are quieter, less defined, more distant. And as you step inside once more, closing the door gently behind you, that understanding settles into place. Not as a burden, but as a fact, something steady, something you can carry. And as the night begins to settle, the familiar quiet wrapping around you once again, you realize that this distance, this separation, is not something you need to fight. It's something you learn to live with, to move within, to accept. Because in this life, it's not just part of the role, it is the role. The longer you stay, the more you begin to notice something strange. The distance never fully disappears, but it shifts. Not toward closeness, but towards something more complicated. It starts with small things. A glance that lingers just a second longer than before. A merchant who doesn't rush quite as quickly when placing something on the table. A guard at the edge of town who nods, just slightly, as you pass. It's not acceptance. But it's not complete avoidance either. It's something in between. You notice it one afternoon while walking past the well. A woman struggles slightly with a heavy bucket, her grip slipping just enough to make the effort visible. You pause. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. You step closer, your movements slow, careful not to startle her. For a moment she stiffens, her body reacting before her mind catches up. Then she sees what you're doing. You reach for the bucket, lifting it with ease, placing it securely on the edge of the well. There's a brief silence. "Thank you," she says quietly. Her voice is cautious, but sincere. You nod once. No more, no less. And then you step back. The moment passes quickly. She doesn't try to continue the conversation, and you don't expect her to. But as you walk away, something feels different, not lighter, just slightly less distant. In some medieval communities, people in roles like yours occupied a strange position. Not fully integrated, but not entirely invisible either. They were known, recognized, sometimes even relied upon in specific ways, despite the general social separation. Historians still argue whether this was a form of reluctant acceptance or simply practical necessity. But the effect is the same. You are part of the town, just not in the usual sense. Later that day, as you move through the quieter side of the market, a man approaches you. That alone is unusual. He doesn't come too close, stopping just beyond arm's reach, his posture slightly tense. I was told, he begins, hesitating, that you might be able to help. You study him for a moment. With what? You ask. He glances around briefly, as if making sure no one is listening. My brother, he says. He's injured. There's a pause. They said you would know what to do. You don't answer immediately, not because you don't understand, but because you do. In some regions, executioners and interrogators were occasionally called upon for tasks others avoided, handling injuries, dealing with certain types of medical situations, even performing procedures that carried a stigma. It wasn't formal medicine, but it was knowledge, practical, direct. Historians still debate how common this dual role was, but enough accounts exist to suggest it wasn't unusual. You nod. I can look, you say. He exhales, relief visible even in that small movement. You follow him to a modest house near the edge of town. Inside, the air is thick, the light dim, and a man sits with his arm held stiffly, his expression tight with discomfort. You approach slowly, your movements measured. There's no instruction here, no guidance, just what you've observed, what you've learned. You examine the arm, your hands steady, your focus narrowing in the same way it does during practice. The principles are familiar: control, awareness, precision. You make a small adjustment, carefully, deliberately. The man exhales, the tension in his face easing slightly. Not gone, but better. That should help, you say. You step back, giving space. The man who brought you nods, placing a small bundle on the table, food, by the look of it, for your trouble. You hesitate for a moment, then accept it, not as payment, but as acknowledgement. As you leave, the air outside feels different, not because anything has changed, but because something has. Back at your home, your mentor is waiting. Of course he is. You helped someone, he says. It's not a question. You nod. Yes. He studies you for a moment. They'll come to you for things like that, he says. There's no approval, no disapproval, just recognition. Does it change anything, you ask? He shakes his head slightly. No. The answer is immediate, clear, because even in these moments, these brief interactions where you are approached rather than avoided, the boundary remains. You are still separate, still outside. But now you understand something new. That separation isn't absolute. It has edges, moments where it softens de nouveau to allow connection. Brief, temporary, but real. That night, as you sit in the quiet, the small bundle resting on the table beside you, your thoughts drift. Not to the work, not to the training, but to that moment. The hesitation, the request, the quiet gratitude. It doesn't change your role, but it changes your understanding of it. Because now you see that you are not just defined by what people fear, but also by what they need, and those two things exist side by side. As the night deepens, the room settling into its familiar stillness, you lie back, your breathing slow, your mind quieter than it has been in days. The contradictions of this life don't resolve. They don't simplify, but they begin to make sense, in their own way, and as sleep begins to take hold, you realize that you're no longer trying to fit into a single definition. You're learning to exist between them. Just like everything else in this world, it starts with whispers, not the kind you hear clearly, but the kind that linger just at the edge of your awareness, half-spoken, quickly dismissed, carried away before they fully reach you. You notice them in passing, in the way conversations pause for a second too long, or how eyes follow you just a little more carefully than before. At first, you think it's just the usual distance, but then you begin to catch fragments. Don't stand too close. They say he knows things. Best not to. You don't react. You've learned not to. But you listen, because there's something different in these words. Not just avoidance, but something deeper, something closer to belief. You see it one evening near the edge of the town, where a small group has gathered around a fire. You're not part of it, of course. You never are. But as you pass by, one of them notices you and falls silent mid-sentence. The others follow. Not out of politeness, but out of caution. One man subtly shifts his position, placing the fire between you and him, as if the flame itself offers some kind of protection. It's a small gesture, but it says everything. In many medieval societies, people associated with roles like yours were often surrounded by superstition. Some believed they carried bad luck, others thought they had knowledge of hidden forces, or that constant proximity to punishment somehow changed them in ways that weren't fully understood. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were rooted in religion, fear, or simple imagination, but the result was the same. You weren't just avoided, you were interpreted. That realization settles quietly in your mind, because it means that people don't just see you as you are, they see something more, or perhaps something else entirely. The next day you notice it again. A woman hanging cloth outside her home stops when she sees you approaching. She quickly adjusts the fabric, turning it so that it hangs between you and her doorway, not aggressively, just carefully, as if creating a barrier. You keep walking, there's no reason to stop, but as you pass, you catch a glimpse of her face tense, focused, almost as if she's performing a small ritual without calling it one. A quirky detail comes to mind, something you once overheard, or perhaps read in a passing moment of curiosity, that in some places people believed those involved in punishment could ward off evil spirits, while others believed they attracted them. A contradiction, protection and danger, existing in the same figure. Historians still argue how widespread these beliefs were, but standing here now, you can feel how easily they take root. Because uncertainty creates space for imagination, and imagination fills it quickly. Later that afternoon, as you return home, you find something unusual waiting for you. A small object placed just outside your door. You pause. It's simple, just a bundle of herbs tied together with thin string. Nothing elaborate, nothing valuable, but intentional. You look around. No one is nearby. You pick it up, examining it briefly before stepping inside. Your mentor notices immediately. "Someone left that?" he asks. You nod. "Yes." He studies it for a moment, then looks back at you. "Keep it," he says. You raise an eyebrow slightly. Why? He leans back, his expression unchanged. Because it means something to them. That answer doesn't fully satisfy you, but it makes sense. You set the bundle down carefully, unsure whether it's meant as a gift, a warning, or something in between. Do you believe it? You ask after a moment. He looks at you. Believe what? The things they say. There's a pause. Then slowly, he shakes his head. No. The answer is simple, firm. But he doesn't dismiss the question entirely. They believe it, he adds, and that, somehow, matters more. Because belief doesn't need to be true to have an effect. It shapes behavior. It creates distance. It builds stories around people like you stories that grow with each passing day, each quiet interaction, each unexplained moment. That evening, as you sit outside, the bundle of herbs resting beside you, you begin to notice the town differently. Not just as a place, but as a collection of perceptions. Each person sees you in their own way. Some with fear, some with curiosity, some with quiet acceptance, and some with something closer to superstition. You think back to the fire, to the way that man positioned himself, to the subtle movements people make when you're near. None of it is loud. None of it is direct, but it's consistent, and consistency creates belief. As the sky darkens, the first stars beginning to appear, you pick up the bundle again, turning it slowly in your hands. It smells faintly of something earthy, calming. You're not sure what it's meant to do. Protect, appease, warn, maybe all three. You place it back down beside you, letting the question remain unanswered, because not everything here needs to be understood. Some things simply exist because people believe they should, and as the night settles in, the quiet wrapping around you once more, you realize that your role is no longer defined only by what you do, but by what others think you are, and that's something you can't control. Not with skill, not with precision, not with anything you've learned so far. It exists outside of you, in their minds, in their stories, in their quiet, whispered assumptions. And as you sit there, the cool air brushing gently against your face, you allow that understanding to settle, not resisting it, not questioning it, just accepting it as another part of this life. Because in this world, reality and belief don't always follow the same path. Sometimes they run side by side, and you stand somewhere in between. Precision becomes everything. Not in a loud, demanding way, but in the quiet, constant awareness that even the smallest mistake carries weight far beyond the moment itself. By now, your movements are no longer uncertain. They are practiced, shaped by repetition, guided by observation. But that doesn't mean they are safe. Because here, almost right isn't enough. You begin to feel it during training first. A slight misalignment in your grip, a fraction too much pressure, a pause that lingers just a second longer than it should. Each time your mentor notices immediately. "Stop," he says, and you do, always. He steps closer, adjusting your hand, your stance, your position, not dramatically, but with subtle corrections that somehow change everything. "You're drifting," he tells you. You frown slightly. I followed the same steps, you reply. He shakes his head. No, you followed what you remember. There's a difference. And it matters, because memory is imperfect, but precision demands consistency. In many historical accounts, roles like yours required not just physical control, but exactness measured actions that avoided unnecessary harm while still fulfilling their purpose. It wasn't chaos or brutality as people often imagine, but something far more controlled. Historians still argue whether this level of precision was always maintained or simply idealized in records. But your mentor makes one thing clear. Mistakes are not acceptable, not because of punishment, but because of consequence. You don't get a second chance to do it correctly, he says quietly. That thought settles heavily, because it means every action carries finality. There's no undoing, no correction after the fact, only before. You repeat the movement again, slower this time, more aware. You feel the shift in your posture, the alignment of your hands, the balance in your stance. It's subtle, but it's there. Better, he says. Not praise, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that's enough. Later that day, you're called again. The building feels familiar now. The heavy doors, the quiet corridors, the stillness that fills every space. But something about today feels different, more focused, more watchful. You step inside, your senses sharpening instinctively. This time, you're not just observing the process, you're observing the details, the exact positioning of everything in the room, the distance between people, the timing of each action, the way your mentor adjusts, even slightly, to maintain control. There's no room for